Good evening, everyone. I'm Nicholas Demoncho, Head of Architecture here at MIT. I extend my thanks and welcome to all of you joining us here online yet again for our fall 2020 public programs. Given that MIT still exists in the world in a physical place, which we are returning to carefully to occupy studios and workshops, I want to begin, as is now our practice, by saying that MIT acknowledges Indigenous people as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced occupation of their territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. Tonight, we welcome architect, landscape architect, and historian Sara Jensen Carr, along with Michael Murphy, founder of the Mass Design Group, who are collaborating with our own Professor John Ochsendorf on a studio this fall, looking at the effect of COVID-19 on our schools and public places. While I'm delighted to engage both John and Michael as new collaborators and colleagues here in Cambridge and Boston, I have to acknowledge also a particular pleasure in welcoming Sara Jensen Carr to MIT, because I've been lucky enough to have her as a collaborator and friend for more than a decade. Before I began to truly understand the deep relationship between public health and the design of public buildings and spaces, Sara was working on these issues in her first architecture degree at Tulane, building on a long and sometimes ignominious history of public health and public space in New Orleans. I first met Sara on the next stop of her intellectual journey at UC Berkeley. There, she was an essential collaborator in teaching as a generous and incisive assistant, then leader of large undergraduate courses we developed together. Most importantly, though, it was her perspective and expertise that shaped my own intellectual and creative trajectory, whose focus on distributed public health through distributed public space would not have been possible without Sara's close and continued collaboration. Sara finished both her MLA and PhD at Berkeley in landscape architecture and environmental planning, with a focus on urban landscapes, human health, and social equity. She continued this work through appointments in architecture and public health at the University of Hawaii, and into her current role as Assistant Professor of Architecture and the Program Director of the Masters in Sustainable Urban Environments at Northeastern University. It's possible from one perspective to imagine that the world has, in the last 6 months, arrived at the area of Sara's particular expertise. But as I think our talk tonight will emphasize, it is far more accurate and important to understand that we never left the space, even in the past half century of antibiotic-fueled amnesia. Recently, as a result of this unwelcome arrival or return, Sara has appeared as a commentator in outlets from Preventive Medicine, the New York Times, CNN, NPR, Foreign Policy, amongst many others, sharing her expertise on epidemics and urban design. Her forthcoming book, Topography of Wellness, How Health and Disease Shape the American Urban Landscape, will be published by the University of Virginia Press, I think very shortly. And we are deeply fortunate to have her as a participant in the life of this department at this moment. As much as we treasure old friendships, though, we also need to treasure and celebrate the gift of new ones. In this spirit, I'm delighted to introduce Michael Murphy as the founding principal and executive director of the Mass Design Group, an interdisciplinary architecture and design collective. As a designer, writer, and teacher, his work investigates the social and political consequences of the built world. Mass's work has been published in over 1,000 publications, many of the same we mentioned in Sara's regard, as well as Domus, the Washington Post, Log, and others. They were awarded the 2017 Cooper Hewitt National Design Award, the 2018 Arts and Letter Award, and the 2020 Wall Street Journal's Innovator of the Year Award. Michael has taught at many places, and we're really happy to have him now here with us at MIT. In the discussion afterwards, Sara and Michael will be joined by two of my new colleagues as well here at MIT. John Ochsendorf, to which the studio provides a welcome return after his recent stint as director of the American Academy in Rome, and Rania Ghosn, who is leading a related option studio this fall on food insecurity in Boston, and whose own expertise and enormous contributions to the department extend not only to this current crisis and the inequity it enhances and reveals, but also into understanding and engaging the larger crisis of climate changes that surrounds it. So with that extended introduction, I leave it over to old friends and new friends and colleagues to lead us in this really essential conversation this evening. You are also a very essential part of this conversation, and I would encourage you to post questions wherever you are watching, down here on the webcast page or on Facebook as well. And with that, I'll leave it over to Sara to begin this evening's conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas, for that incredibly generous introduction. It's such an honor, after considering you to be a mentor for so many years, to be a colleague, and it's been a real honor also to be an extended part of the MIT community this semester, teaching with John and Michael and getting to know Rania as well. So thank you very much, everybody, for having me here tonight. So as Nicholas went over the main parts of my biography, I'll be getting into them in a little bit more detail soon, but it's been a strange several months for everybody. Personally, it's been very strange as an obscure academic who has suddenly had a lot of attention on their work, and you know, doing these interviews from my living room with 3 small children running around. But you know, as somebody who's been thinking about how health and diseases have formed the urban landscape for a decade now, I'm honestly still trying to wrap my head around what the COVID-19 pandemic means. And while I don't have any predictions about its future, and I'm looking forward to the discussion tonight, what I do want to talk about tonight is how the history of American epidemics got us to the landscape we currently inhabit, and what we must keep in mind at this inflection point in time. I'm going to share my screen. So, as Nicholas mentioned, I got my architecture degree at Tulane in New Orleans, and I actually started my career working on healthcare facilities. And when you say you research health and built environment, that's what most people think. But in that time, I became really fascinated by the body of evidence-based design employed in thinking about architecture and patient outcomes. In particular, I was interested in the landmark study by Roger Ulrich, showing that post-op patients that were in rooms facing trees healed faster, sometimes up to a whole day, and required less pain medication than patients facing brick walls. I was really interested in projects such as these cancer centers that let patients look out on gardens during long chemotherapy sessions. And I was very drawn to the research on therapeutic landscapes by Claire Cooper Marcus and Naomi Sachs. So in environments that are defined by sterility, to see this trend towards introducing landscape was invigorating, especially as somebody that was really always interested in what was going on between buildings, maybe more than was happening within them. But then the other part of the story is that I was working at this time in New Orleans and was living there when Hurricane Katrina hit the city. Like almost everybody that was lucky enough to, I evacuated. Like fewer, I had the privilege to come back when many didn't. And my life was consumed with the recovery for some time, doing FEMA surveys, rehabilitating client buildings, and going to community planning meetings. And I started to think during this time, in the absence of hospitals, which is how it was for some months after the hurricane, how does the urban landscape heal and harm us? And this is what led me to go to UC Berkeley to get my MLA and then PhD in environmental planning, and my fortuitous meeting with Nicholas and collaboration with him. But I think when I started this shift, I naively thought that I would come up with some sort of landscape guidelines for health, similar to how you would read the AIA and AAH guidelines. And even if that was my goal, even if I thought that was my goal, I'd already seen how landscape could be wielded to displace people in the name of well-being and safety. In particular, the type of unspecified top-down green space we often see in vision plans. For those that are not familiar, this is the infamous green dot map released by the Bring New Orleans Back Commission after Hurricane Katrina, which widely deemed low-lying areas to be raised for parks. This was discomforting for anybody that lived there, obviously. And to be in New Orleans during the recovery and hear the constant conversation about rebuilding healthier communities and what was implied in that drove me to look for more specific answers about what that meant. And so while I'm still driven by that exploration, and I still strongly believe in the power of urban landscapes in addressing health, I came in somewhat skeptical of how these conversations are often framed. And then another dimension of my research was inspired by where my first academic appointment was. Up until just about 2 years ago, I held a joint appointment in the School of Architecture and Office of Public Health Studies at University of Hawaii at Manoa. Living on an island, I became more interested in how ecology and climate change are related to health outcomes. And I'm actually working on some research now for Places Journal, looking at the Ahapua system, which is an indigenous closed loop system of land management, and how their fracture in the building of Honolulu has related to Native Hawaiian health outcomes. I think the most beneficial part of that time was to understand how a discipline completely outside of architecture does research and practice. I'm showing here some work we did with the Native Hawaiian Health Program at Queens Medical Center, we were very involved in designing spaces for health, but that were outside the healthcare facility itself. And this is a class of half doctoral students in public health and half architecture students, whereas the former would act as practitioners and experts and the latter as interpreters. And in this design by Jeremy Mendoza, this is a design for a hale, or a meeting place that's actually outside the hospital, based on the shape of the hapu'u fern, which is a medicinal plant found in Hawaii. However, to get to the subject at matter of hand tonight, in an effort to better understand how our present day landscape shapes our health, I also wanted to better understand the history of shifting ideas about the public health and the public realm. And while Nicholas called me a historian, and I think I was referred to such in the New Yorker as well, I'm not a historian. I am a designer, I'm an architect and a landscape architect, but I was really driven by finding the history of where we ended up today. And so what was somewhat of a chapter-long detour in my dissertation has now become a book that will be out early next year from University of Virginia Press. I just got the cover design, so I'm showing it here tonight. And the book has allowed me to explore some of those ideas, along with some nascent thoughts about where we go from here, although they need to be hastily added to the book before publication, as I unfortunately turned in the manuscript into image clearances just before the pandemic hit the United States, but luckily they're giving me the manuscript back to add a coda of sorts. But where this started was thinking about how the places we live are inextricably tied to our health, as modern day diseases are often a complicated knot of genetic, lifestyle, and environmental factors. In 2016, Karen DeSalvo, the interim secretary of the US Department of Health and Human Services, noted that public health had entered a new era where one's zip code is a better indicator of health than genetic code. What I was most interested in is how we move the conception of an unhealthy environment being a densely populated urban center, as you see on the left, to an unhealthy environment being the car-centric suburban and exurban environment that is decried by many planners and public health researchers today. And I think prior to the current pandemic, we definitely saw a shift over the past 150 years in what is considered a healthy and unhealthy environment. The idea that urban areas affect our health is by no means new, but from the mid-century on, the perceived effect was wholly negative. Literature describing the so-called urban crisis decried the corrupting influence of the city, and you can see the progression here all the way from Mitchell Gordon's 6 cities to Mike Davis's Dead Cities. But we've also envisioned the city as a metaphor for the body itself. We all know the popular conception of parks as the lungs of the city, an argument that landscape architects and urban planners use to argue for increased urban forests and parks to clean polluted air. However, we have also seen urban blight described as a cancer to be contained, inoculated, and eliminated, a platform on which to advocate for the disastrous policies of urban renewal. And even after germ theory severed formal collaborations between urban planning and public health, which I'll talk a little bit about in more detail tonight, we've always sought to understand cities in terms of our own bodies and vice versa, as we see in these plates from O.M. Unger's city metaphors. And of course, here is relating it back to the machine or the car, relating intestines to sewer systems to exhaust, bones to streets to chassis, and nervous systems to power grids to electric systems. But the thought of the city as a locus of health rather than disease is new, as is the suburbs as an incubator of illness. The body of early 21st century literature that celebrated the city came as a result of chronic disease, particularly those diseases related to obesity, after it surpassed infectious disease as the primary cause of mortality in the United States. Both public health researchers and urban planners and then designers have sought to reconnect the fields. When I began my dissertation work, I realized there was actually an abundance of literature that provided guidelines for healthy places. They didn't need another one. But what I found with a lot of this literature is that they, much like the green dot map, presented designing the built environment for health as a straightforward and unambiguous and even moral act, when I knew from my experience in New Orleans that rebuilding cities and neighborhoods is much more fraught than many architects and urban planners would make it out to be. So when looking at environments for the health, I think when we look around us, we can see the marks of different types of thinking about health and disease and really how our bodies absorb the environments around us. What I see when I look around is that in response to epidemics, we have designed our environments to control miasma, germs, and behavior in 3 distinct eras over time. Starting with miasma. Hippocrates on airs, waters, and places connected the health of the environment to the health of those that inhabit it. His writings describe the difference between wholesome and unwholesome waters, the latter being marshy and stagnant, and describing those that drank from the waters as in possession of large and obstructed spleens. Their bellies are hard, emaciated, and hot, and their shoulders, collarbones, and faces are emaciated. The theory of miasma had wide acceptance well into the 20th century, most notably in the form of miasma theory, which associated tangibly foul air and water to airborne disease. The first movement connecting the built environment to population health correlates with the beginning of American urban history during the Industrial Revolution. As factories and workforce populations grew in city centers, so did the amount of waste and sewage dumped in the streets. Slaughterhouses were often still inside city limits, and there was no municipal sanitation, and air pollution was rampant. Many housing units lacked indoor plumbing or sufficient light and fresh air. The massive outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and yellow fever required coordinated action between planners, engineers, public health officials, and doctors in these fields. Of particular concern were the crowded tenements. This cartoon, featured in Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper in 1865, was entitled "The Tenement Houses of New York, How the Poor Live in Crowded Cities, How Pestilence is Generated, and How Parents are Demoralized and Their Children Depraved, the Great Source of Destitution and Crime." Social scientists, who were just beginning to explore the connections between environment and behavior, pointed to physical density as a risk factor for both moral contagion as well as disease spread. And so cholera and other filth diseases became ever more correlated with the generalized urban condition, especially regarding dense housing. Here we see cholera as a skeleton telling the landlord of a tenement that he is about to occupy the premises. Tenements were routinely described as perpetual fever nests by New York sanitary inspectors in their surveys. And so the biggest first changes to our cities came from massive sanitary infrastructure. It was during this time that many of the combined sewage, wastewater, and street runoff systems were installed in cities. Naturally open waterways, which also often served as worker encampments as well as waste conveyance, were contained in underground culverts and paved over. Marshlands were filled in, not only to get rid of miasmic gases, but also to accommodate industrial expansion at the edges of cities. The outfall of these waste systems were still often to open water bodies, but at least it was moved out of the city. And many subscribe to the idea that the solution to pollution is dilution. It's interesting to note that many of these systems are actually still in place today. And although a significant body of scientists and doctors actually did not believe that disease was spread through the air or through miasma theory, a multi-pronged strategy of personal and municipal sanitation, alleviating density in housing, and remaking or removing industry and worker housing radically remade what had previously been the haphazard landscape of American cities. Here we can see in the 1895 edition of Harper's Weekly comparing photos of the same street corners just 2 years apart, showing what an incredible transformation street paving and street cleaning had affected. So waste infrastructure really reconfigured the streets of our cities. They became longer, straighter, and wider to assist conveyance of waste. Cobblestones that were thought to hold miasmic filth between them were switched out for pavement that could be washed down at the end of the day. And in remaking our cities, many looked to Europe to see how they had controlled their own cholera epidemics as well as planned their cities, specifically in that massive underground waste infrastructure, but also theoretically in these thinkings about urban planning and the body. In his book, Flesh and Stone, Richard Sennett discusses how many 18th and 19th century European cities prioritized circulation and movement via their street networks in the wake of physician William Harvey's discoveries about how the heart powered blood circulation. Dirt and grime were thought to clog healthy air throughout the city. Palaces and places of commerce acted as hearts that powered movement, and one-way streets were employed to maintain fast movement and mimic the directionality of veins and arteries. And of course, we see this connection probably most clearly in Daniel Burnham's plan of Chicago, which echoed these wide boulevards, the planting of trees, and constant cleaning to get rid of that filth and grime. Burnham also ushered in the next era. With streets and sanitary infrastructure transformed, American cities turned to parks as a way to breathe fresh air into cities. Frederick Law Olmsted, the designer of Central Park, was also the executive secretary of the U.S. Sanitary Commission. And his time in that position convinced him that density and slum conditions were the root causes of disease, and disease was carried through water and atmosphere. Central Park and many other of these parks leveraged fear about the detrimental health effects of diseases to advocate for the health benefits of green space, from providing a mental health respite from the business of the city to the supposed filtering effects of trees on bad air. Olmsted was an early proponent of what we would now call ecosystem services. And in his book on public parks and the enlargement of towns, he wrote, "Air is disinfected by sunlight and foliage. Foliage also acts mechanically to purify the air by screening it. Opportunity and inducement to escape at frequent intervals from the confined and light-shaded air of the commercial quarter, and to supply the lungs with air screened and purified by trees, and recently acted upon by sunlight, together with opportunity and inducement to escape from conditions requiring vigilance, wariness, and activity toward other men." The associations between density and disease would also manifest themselves in Ebenezer Howard's Garden City, a town model that sought to effectively combine the mobility of the city with the perceived health of rural life, and with the goal of moving people out of the city entirely. By giving each imagined citizen a fixed plot of land, distinct pedestrian networks to a downtown, and a collective agricultural greenbelt and town fund, Howard was not only proposing simple exposure to nature, but prescribing exacting economic and social relationships. The density of the Garden City model was approximately 5,000 people per square mile, which is almost the same as many inner ring suburbs today. However, these cities were never built as self-contained social and economic units, mostly due to the elimination of the green belt, mostly due to space constraints for towns that were built, and of course, the failure of individual farming to catch on. That said, many were attracted to the suburbs' promise of fresh air, individual plots of green space, and the Garden City did provide the template for many of our early American suburbs. Health, and specifically the search for fresh air, was in fact a large driver of the move to Western cities like Phoenix and Denver as well, which grew significantly by specifically recruiting asthmatics. Dr. Charles Dennison's Rocky Mountain Health Resorts in 1880 advertised Colorado as the Switzerland of the Americas, evoking images of clean mountain air and the generally accepted superior moral values of Europeans. This map by Dennison attempts to show the climatic patterns of Colorado, specifically its dry, cool air. And in the book, he details the conditions of each settlement in the state. Of Colorado Springs, he said, "It is the home also of a cultivated class of people who have been attracted to the state by its health conditions." It's estimated that up to a quarter of people who settled in Colorado, Arizona, and California in the late 1800s and very early 1900s did so for their health or for a family member's health. Ironically, agriculture and increasing irrigation that supported the settlement, many developed allergies after they moved there. Even so, by 1890, Denver had grown by almost a third, with almost 30,000 people moving there to treat consumption. And this rate of growth would persist for the next 3 decades. However, the commonly accepted ideas of how the environment affected our health was upended with the development of vaccines. The immediacy of infectious disease had abated somewhat, but it didn't stop architects and landscape architects from still exploring those ideas. Knowing that the pandemics of the early 1900s, namely flu and tuberculosis, could be addressed by medicine, density was no longer an immediate concern, but thinking about how architecture could optimize bodies and health was still a fascination to many, in particular Le Corbusier. Even though concepts of health and built environment had become mostly theoretical at this point, and earlier ideas about miasma, combined with developing building technology, but also fears about dangers of the streets, increasingly congested by cars. Corbusier's Radiant City was conceived as a vertical garden city, taking the sanitary infrastructure up as well. Corbusier envisioned all interactions as internal to the building itself, and so the street as a public realm was eliminated because of his thought that he was liberating his building's residents from the filth or grime. Corbusier's machines for living were intensely focused on what the right measurements were for an individual, and thinking that a community was made simply by reproducing those units over and over again. In his writings for the Radiant City, Corbusier specified, that each occupant of a cell would get 14 square meters, would have 12 meters of plate glass windows. The air would always be at 64.4 degrees Fahrenheit, that 8 liters of air would go through the rooms every minute for what he called exact respiration, that people would walk no more than 100 meters to transport, whether it be elevator or taxi, and that 50 meters above ground level is where you could access the pure air, which leaves the question who got to live below 50 meters. But essentially what Corbusier was proposing here with these sort of vaccination-like units of air and sunlight. And so while Corbusier has only one built work in the United States, we can see the influence of his writing and the European consortium SIAM in many public housing units that were built in the mid-century. But without the context of European social safety nets, many of the ideas that they pushed, extreme density to keep green space around buildings, reimagining the corridor as a place of social interaction, and perhaps most of all, the aesthetic disruption and separation from existing context to convey its modernism, sterility, and health, ended up being detrimental to resident health instead. These mixed metaphors of bodies and architecture and cities were also wielded to ruinous ends in the mid-century. Cancer was an epidemic that researchers soon realized could not be conquered by vaccines. A federally funded early 1960s study even attempted to inject hundreds of monkeys with human tumors in a desperate effort to pinpoint the cancer germ, but to no avail. In Susan Sontag's Illness as Metaphor, written in 1977, she confronts the late 20th century's era's preoccupation with cancer by comparing it to the previous tuberculosis epidemic, saying, "Now it is cancer's turn to be the disease that doesn't knock before it enters, cancer that fills the role of an illness experienced as a ruthless secret invasion, a role it will keep until one day its etiology becomes as clear and its treatment as effective as those of TB have become." The unknowability of cancer is what made it so terrifying, but also made it an apt way to communicate the direness of the urban condition and spur action. The concurrent epidemic of urban disinvestment, disintegration, and abandonment, commonly referred to as blight, often leaned on cancer as a metaphor, especially as it appeared to similarly eat cities from the inside out in the form of fire, vice, and crime. Geographer Michael Deere wrote that the process of abandonment as it operates in space suggests an initial broad scattering of abandoned structures, characterized internally by the occurrence of many small groups of abandoned houses. It is essentially a contagious sequence. Contagion has major implications for our understanding of the dynamics of abandonment and for later policy considerations. This treatment of blight as a disease also extended to its documentation. Much like the famous John Snow map before it, blighted properties were often documented by public health agencies going from door to door, searching for the vectors of contagion. A 1951 architectural forum advertised slum surgery in St. Louis, showing blighted and obsolete districts beginning to encroach on the rest of the city grid, the former district shaded as if to erase their existing characteristics. Similar to how blight maps were used, an educational film from 1953 entitled The Warning Shadow used X-ray animations to depict the terrifying growth of a small black dysplasia on a man's lung. The film ends with the patient agreeing to a pneumonectomy, or surgical removal of the lung. Eradication by surgery or radium was the preferred treatment for the disease. And architects and planners seized on this treatment as a model for how blight should be treated in cities. Many municipal departments, aided by private companies like the Rand Corporation, first attempted immunizations, such as increased municipal services, including fire and police stations, and attempts to enforce stricter building codes. When this failed, they turned toward an urban chemotherapy, the total eradication of these clusters of blight. In his book, The City, Its Growth, Its Decay, Its Future, E.L.L. Sarnon used a diagram of the disintegration of cells to discuss the disintegration of the fabric of the city and a healthy cell as a model of rebuilding. He wrote, "The slums he clears by piecemeal mending, and the old infects the new in short order. The planner must know, as well as the doctor, that when the head aches, the stomach might be out of order. And the planner must be aware of the fact as well that the doctor, that vitality cannot be transfused into a dead organ. The dead organ must be removed and the transfusion effected in a healthy part of the body. He must unearth the roots of the evil. He must amputate slums by a decisive surgery. And he must transfuse vitality only into those areas that are protected against contagion. As they had in the sanitary movement, children were invoked as innocent victims in order to further their cause. James W. Follen, Commissioner of the Urban Renewal Administration, in a talk entitled Slums and Blight, A Disease of Urban Life, showed Gussie, a cartoon depiction of a waif-like young white girl as proxy for the deadly effects of slums on human life. She is introduced standing on a pile of rubble or adrift on a sea of blight. The book shows a series of maps overlaying juvenile delinquency, lack of sanitation, tuberculosis, and population density, with the densest occurrences happening, quote unquote, always pointing to the center of cities. Later, Gussie is shown wielding the gargantuan broom of code enforcement of health and sanitation. And to address this issue, urban renewal documents from New York City to San Francisco depicted strikingly similar landscapes, sleek, sterile towers on a flat platform of green. San Francisco's Jackson Square plan is showed as isolated from any existing fabric, save for City Hall, with no mention of the Fillmore neighborhood as a cultural center for the West Coast small Black population. Indeed, 80% of those removed by urban renewal were Black. In Baltimore, the number was reported to be 100%. The logic of blight as disease was eradication, erasure, and reoccupation with a healthy graft of anonymous towers in green. Which brings us to our pre-pandemic age and how the fabric of our cities has, as of late, been planned to control behavior. And much of this is in response to the obesity crisis. The Centers for Disease Control reported that in the United States, the percentage of overweight adults hovered at 31% between 1960 and 1994, and the percentage of adults categorized as obese increased from 13% to 23%, meaning almost 55% of adults in the mid-1990s were overweight or obese. In 2005, it was estimated to incur over $190 billion, or almost 21% of all US healthcare expenditures. Researchers started to draw connections between larger patterns of change in society, ranging from food availability to technological attachment. But a great deal of literature started to point to sedentary lifestyles, encouraged by the unabated suburban growth oriented around the automobile as the driver of the epidemic. By the end of the 20th century, the locus of disease would shift from the city to the suburbs. These figures notwithstanding, the definition of obesity is still problematic in many respects, from the unreliability of the body mass index and its relationship to overall health to cultural and racial ideas of ideal bodies and diets. Nevertheless, many designers and urban planners saw an opportunity to elevate their practice in the name of public health, although in many cases they instead exacerbated health inequities. On a related point, though, many also pointed out that car-centric design exacerbates climate change in urban heat islands, which represents a larger existential threat to all of our health. So in response, the new urbanism was one of the first responses to this growing epidemic. This movement was based on highly specific urban and architectural codes to build neo-traditional neighborhoods. And although not directly referenced, the American Public Health Association's Planning the Neighborhood document from some 30 years before Suburban Nation is an obvious predecessor to new urbanist literature, particularly if you look at the APHA's preoccupation with density formulas, once again, land use, and architectural form of the dwelling, with less attention to the overall landscape other than ensuring some form of walkability. Now, some of the generalized observations and principles of Suburban Nation were common sense, especially at the time, and even admirable in theory. But when enacted on the ground, it became almost immediately problematic. In their steadfast belief that the old way of building was best, they emphasized the historical blind spots of building for social change and uncritically doubled down. DPC's urban codes were a prescriptive landscape, not just to address obesity, but a claim to also improve social cohesion, civic participation, and above all, eliminate cars from the public realm. And these early new urbanists were particularly taken with regional interpretations of European architecture in the Deep South. Dwani and Slater-Zyberk have cited that their inspirations came from a road trip to towns such as Savannah, Charleston, and Natchez, Mississippi, but they don't reference the racial, social, or class systems inherent in these different forms of dwelling. Most of all, building to the prescriptive guidelines was difficult to enact within our existing tangle of sprawl And instead, many of these developments were relegated to being built on greenfields and far from job centers. And so in some cases, only increased the problems of sprawl. However, the willingness of governments to invest in the supposedly curative effects of new urbanism, just as they had invested in modernism a few decades before, became apparent. In the mid-1990s, it was adopted as the standard architectural and planning style of public housing under the Clinton administration's Hope 6 development plan. Hope 6 did attempt to take some lessons learned from that disastrous mid-century modernist public housing development, proposing a scattered site strategy that would strategically infill often slightly higher income neighborhoods with smaller scale single or multifamily housing. But just as in the mid-century, the tactic of adopting a specific aesthetic for public housing, even if it was neo-traditionalism instead of modernism, still served to visually stigmatize those that lived within, while continuing to imply that those living in the houses would be uplifted and have their morals and health corrected through architecture. And while it was mostly a failure in administration rather than design, the well-documented effects of displacement wrought by the Hope 6 program, as old high-density units were torn down to build new, smaller ones and less numerous ones, were one of the largest detriments to residents' health in the end. Nevertheless, we still view the built environment as a treatment for epidemics, extending from the figurative prescription of new urbanism to now literally being prescribed by the US Surgeon General, as seen in their 2015 Step It Up campaign. Now, I just want to make clear that many of these movements were positive. To provide an environment that supports walking and biking is definitely positive, but it will take a lot more to untangle our car-centric environments. As cities and walkable environments have become more in demand, these ostensibly healthier and greener neighborhoods have also become less affordable. And so I believe we need to interrogate the idea at the same time that the design, planning, and even public health community, when they denigrate the suburbs, we need to realize that this is also a time when many of those suburbs are becoming more racially and economically heterogeneous, a far cry from those described 30 years ago in suburban nation. Moreover, we need to rethink the idea in the United States that where we live is a free choice, or that it always reflects one's moral fortitude. But this is sadly appropriate for a country that has always conflated wellness with personal responsibility. So as I mentioned, I turned in the manuscript just before the pandemic reached the United States, but I have been thinking a lot about the recurring patterns that we see right now, or that we've seen over the past 7 months. And it does in fact feel like we've seen a century pass by in these past several months as well. What we need to realize is that the built environment provides opportunities for, but also poses risks to health, and that our conception of healthy places changes with medical knowledge and different pandemics. But over time, we've built healthy places that are often only for people that can afford them. So health has become an amenity rather than an ethic of building and planning. What's interesting, I think, is that all the fears of past epidemics have really become made urgent again with COVID-19. That is, it sort of exploits all our fears of miasma, germs, and behavior in the built environment. As we know, it is in the air, it is an airborne disease, but at the same time, we continue to sanitize our surfaces or our groceries if you're doing that. And we've changed our behavior to socially distance and quarantine. And at the same time, many of the ways past epidemics were addressed in the urban environment have proven to be consistent to today's pandemic. We know that now that green space is very essential to health outcomes, as is sanitation and the design of where we live. So naturally, architects and landscape architects are wondering how this will transform design. For what it's worth, I don't think it will lead to this type of workplace, nor will it lead to this being a permanent fixture in our restaurants. And hopefully this doesn't become our permanent condition either. And nor is it even this. I think, and what I keep emphasizing every time I've been asked what does the post-pandemic city look like is, we don't know yet. And we also need to realize that the built environment can't address the failures of our health system, inequities in treatment, and most of all, the built environment itself is not a vaccine. But every crisis forces us to rethink the way we live, especially hand in hand with emerging technologies, such as the ones I talked about here, whether it's wastewater infrastructure, the railroad, or mass production. And so that, along with the narrative of disease that most people accept is what forms our landscapes. But there's another consistency as well. Every epidemic and the most misguided of its built environment cures affects immigrants and communities of color most acutely. And this starts with us being a country that's founded on the removal of its indigenous people, who were first decimated by the epidemics brought by colonizers, and then were systematically and forcibly moved off the land that they had stewarded for centuries, while the settlers celebrated their unspoiled quality and built resorts and cabins there for their own health. This painting by Thomas Cole celebrates the American landscape that we associate with fresh air and water, devoid of man's pollution. But at the same time, it sublimates the solitary figure of a Native American man, hidden in the bottom foreground of the picture, the absence of his tribe speaking as much as his hidden presence. And then there is this cartoon drawn around the same time as the cholera epidemic from Puck magazine, where cholera was conflated with newcomers. The title of this piece called "The Kind of Assisted Immigrant We Cannot Afford to Admit," and with cholera depicted as a skeleton in vaguely Middle Eastern clothing. Over time, instead of taking consideration of the poor as a population vulnerable to disease, we have instead blamed them for spreading the contagion in the first place, and then have systematically removed and quarantined them, physically or economically, or subjected them to architectural experiments that are built on narratives and metaphor rather than epidemiology or backed up by larger social safety nets. A 1922 housing covenant for Silver Spring, Maryland read, "For the purposes of sanitation and health, no owner will sell or lease the said land of anyone of a race whose death rate is at a higher percentage than the white race." Germ theory and the language of quarantine was extensively used in Baltimore's residential segregation ordinance of 1910, which kept Blacks from moving into blocks that had a white majority of residents, even when a series of coordinated actions by the city had also excluded Black residents from healthcare access and neighborhood improvements. In San Francisco's Chinatown, disease was used as a justification for the Department of Public Health to repeatedly raid and control the neighborhood's boundaries, with medical inspections and largely fabricated assessments on nearby Angel Island also used to keep the Chinese out of the city altogether. We have to consider how health has been used to exclude groups from desirable landscapes and conscribe them to landscapes of risk. A recent study from a group of University of California researchers argued that we need to reckon with how our social practice has long-lasting physiological effects. By overlaying mortgage companies' redlining maps with health data, they not only found that these neighborhoods were still largely occupied by Blacks and immigrants, but there have remained a plethora of environmental hazards, from air pollution to lead content in the soil, in some places resulting in disparities of health, like a 3 times higher asthma rate in Blacks than whites. And let us not forget that even the most celebrated healthy landscape, Central Park, designed by a revered landscape architect, abolitionist, and former public health officer, was built on the ruins of Seneca Village, a thriving African-American village that was nonetheless written up as a squatter's camp, squalid and pestilent in the popular press. So instead of thinking about decontamination rooms in our houses or plexiglass desks, maybe we should be asking ourselves about the conditions that cause urban heat islands and air pollution disproportionately in Black neighborhoods, which have now proven to be underlying causes for COVID-19 mortality. Instead of worrying about the conception of a very specific type of walkable and bikeable density that has dominated urban design discourse for the past couple decades, we should concern ourselves with the crowded housing for frontline workers, the forgotten density so eloquently written about by Canadian urbanist Jay Pitter in Azure magazine recently, and think about if they have equitable access to green space and public transportation. We need to ask ourselves now, what is it about suburban neighborhoods that are now seeing the spread of the disease? I think at the beginning of the pandemic, I was asked by numerous outlets, New York Times being one, if the high rates in New York and Boston signaled the end of cities. But now that it's abated in these places for now, and the pandemic has spiked in other places, from the suburbs of Phoenix and the rural areas of South Dakota, where I come from, and is now home to, I think, one of the largest per capita rates of COVID-19, but also the Black and brown neighborhoods of the very same cities we were worried about before, places that lie at the margins. Why aren't we asking ourselves what it is about these environments that is accelerating the rate of infection? The environment does not cause or cure disease, but it is a key factor in either providing opportunities for health or creating the risk of debilitating illness. The landscapes we inhabit do embed themselves in our bones and organs, some pathways known and some not. In her essay, Shifting Sites, landscape architect Christina Hill discussed how in culture and in ecological science, we have long viewed our skins as a boundary between us and the natural world, but instead it is permeable to energy, materials, and organisms. And as we now know, the burdens of an inequitable social system, accumulating illness, but also resiliency over generations. So as we endure this crisis and understand that there are others ahead of us, let us take what we have learned from history and shape a healthier future for all. And thank you so much for having me here tonight. I think I hand it over to Michael.
Wow, amazing. Sara, what a profound and incredible presentation. So much to consider, so rich, and a lot of things I hadn't thought about before. I've learned so much just listening to you here, and I hope our conversation today can expand on that. So thank you for giving us so much to consider. I've been asked to respond, so I write something up to respond to this. And I think where Sara has left us is not just where we can consider the relationship of health in the built environment, but also where we have faltered, where we might grow as designers and as architects and as a profession. But her question, how do we implement an expectation of ethics of practice and not a purchasable commodity of health, prompted me to consider possibly where the consideration of health in the built environment also grounds us in another set of discussions about really why architecture does still matter. And this brings us to, I think, considering why the COVID epidemic is unveiling so many other overlapping disciplines that we need to think about. Notably, in the role of the liberation or restriction of foundational human rights. And I would say this as maybe the primary right, the right to breathe. In the realm of rights, the right to breathe is possibly of the highest order. Without breath, there really is no life. But to breathe freely, as we have learned over the course of recent events, is not a guarantee. As an individual, breathing air free of the novel coronavirus requires spaces filled with exchanged or decontaminated air. And those spaces are not always in our control, nor equally accessed, nor designed with fresh, disease-free air as their primary concern. The failure is really a failure of our built world, one where the pandemic reveals rights rescinded and hindered, rights facilitated, yes, by structural injustices that lead to inequitable distribution of services, housing, healthcare, et cetera, but managed, mitigated, and filtered through buildings. It is architecture then that is the limiting factor for the right to clean air, because it is architecture which determines whether we have access to it or not. The spatial rights have been largely understood as collective rights. As Henry Lefebvre or later David Harvey described the right to the city as common collective rights determined by common collective action. Harvey quotes, "Since transformation inevitably depends upon the exercise of collective power to reshape the process of urbanization," in his book, Social Justice in the City. But radical geographers like Edward Soja remind us that the built world around us will always reinforce those power relationships of our social order. And so space and justice are inextricably linked and in dialogue with ever-changing power relationships. In this argument, the collective injustices of racism, police violence, surveillance, segregation are likewise spatial and impossible to untangle, the complicities in the spatial disciplines ever present. As a set of actions, designers and planners are left wondering where, in fact, just planning solutions might be enacted without reinforcing oppressive power relationships, the paralysis, we might call it. The clarion call, "We can't breathe," suggests, as Susan Say rightly pointed out, that breath is a geography in itself, managed through the lens of power and access. In 1968, at the height of global protests against war and injustice, architects felt a similar sense of paralysis and then retrenched from accountability. As Bernard Tschumi noted in an interview, architecture was considered to be tied to power, the power of the state, the power of money, the power of multinational corporations, the power of capitalist society, and therefore, there was absolutely no way it could transform the power structure of society. Many left the discipline altogether, or like Robert Venturi, concurred and suggested that architects needed to narrow their purview in response to a growing ineffectualness. Power, Venturi argued, should be left to the powerful. While 2020 might remind us of 1968, primary differences emerge when we consider this very term, effectualness. One in particular is how the pandemic is a global one, affecting nearly all 8 billion people on the planet. And while each place has reacted in their own ways, the fundamental change is existential before it is cultural, that we are awakening to our health and our access to each breath spatially. We are experiencing a spatial awakening, that breathing is in fact a spatial problem, and one we are more empowered to take control back from. In the theory of spatial rights, this suggests possibly a new beachhead, a new opportunity, that space affects not just our collective rights, as Harvey and Lefebvre talk about, but our individual rights as well, ones we are able to more clearly and succinctly demand control over. So what do we do about all of this? If buildings are making us sicker, how can they make us healthier? Might be the simple question. Sara showed us that this relationship between disease and design has always asked some version of this very question. The tangled, knotty condition of architecture's history and its future is inextricably linked to health outcomes, and history also offers some lessons. Sara mentioned the insufferable blind spots and errors, egregious, nefarious, and malignant, but also there are successes too. We have a saying that design is never neutral. It helps or it hurts, but neutrality is not an option. So we might consider within the failures also the successes that operationalize this ethic that Sara mentions. For instance, in the sanitation era was certainly Olmsted, but also Isambard Brunel and Florence Nightingale, whose Renkoy Hospital claimed a reduction in mortality of upwards of 70% during the Crimean War. These solutions led not just to floor plans and fenestration studies, but the design of new types of buildings, new standards of measurement, new designs of data analysis, and the design of disciplinary shifts like nursing. Outcomes were real, positive, and spatial. Or as Margaret Campbell, Beatrice Colomina, and Dan Barber have recently reminded us, the aim of health in our building stock has led to conditions that have influenced our discipline more than we may have originally realized. How, for instance, taking the cure to reduce incidence of airborne disease like tuberculosis had more to do with the emergence of modernism's flat roofs, clean white walls, and light-filled rooms than the international style historicism might have argued. Not just functionalism, it was health, healing, and possibly hope that drove architectural innovations, shifts in style, and changes to building science. This very question has inspired the research of my own practice, Mass Design Group, and our founding charge, not dissimilar to Nightingale's, is how can this miasma or contaminated air be reduced in hospitals, spaces often built without large mechanical systems to utilize, itself an injustice of a lack of access to fundamental rights. And while we found a range of design strategies that we can deploy to ensure that we breathe freely, and I'm sure we're hearing about them every day in our schools and restaurants and public spaces, policies, standards, and measurements emerge certainly to help with that. We also found that contamination of air is not simply an issue managed only by the changing of a HEPA filter. No, instead as we learned from the COVID pandemic, multiple scales of infection occur simultaneously, from the body to the neighborhood to the region and even the planet. And while we might offer solutions to building design standards about managing airflow without recognizing and addressing the spatial implications of the regional and planetary scales, we are left with incongruous data to make the case for what is at the core of this crisis is something we have faced before, namely how our built world breathes, inhibits access to that most fundamental human right, the right to breathe. One thing is different this time around. The global pandemic of COVID-19, the world and each of its inhabitants are experiencing a collective spatial awakening. We are, all of us, hunkered down in our houses, staying away from collective spaces, asking for architecture to do something more for us, for our buildings to protect us, for this air to not contaminate us. And in that ask is also a call to action for us as a discipline. Will we again cede our power to the powerful and build a fortress of autonomy? Or will we, like Nightingale or Neutra or Alto, dig in, acknowledge the power latent in the built world around us in order to harness it and redistribute it more effectively? For this time around, I do have some hope that that might be the case. So thank you. That's my commentary. I'm going to open it up to Rania and John to start the questions.
Well, that was terrific. Thank you both so very much. And I'd like to give Rania the privilege of asking the first question, and I'd like to remind the audience to please add questions to the chat, either on Facebook or on the webcast.
Thank you, John, Sarah, and Michael, for opening up your studio conversations to the rest of the school and to the rest of the world. It's a privilege to be able to think with you all, and it was a fantastic presentation, Sarah, Michael, such an inspiring work and a lot to look forward to with your practice and your thinking about the world. So I come at the question of health through the paradigm maybe of expanding some of its coupled term care to another project, and maybe that of the planet. So I'm curious to thinking about what we can learn from the coupling of healthcare to expanding that project to maybe a project of earth care, as some of our colleagues at MIT are inviting us to do. And maybe in that, expanding the conversation from the paradigms of rights to some of what contemporary feminist critics and anthropologists have invited us to consider, which is the language of care. Care and vulnerability as they begin to address a question of the presence of an embodied environment, an environment that thinks of the centrality of the body as a category. So both the talk and the response make it super clear how public health crisis and infectious disease management leave their mark on architecture and the city, landscape and practice, and interconnect multiple scales, that of the individual body, that of the social body, and that of a body politic. So we grapple with the way that biologies and relations are made and remade in the world. So how do we come to think in our contemporary moment of the longer standing conversations about biopolitics, what Michel's Foucault concept on the management of life have invited us to articulate in terms of the bios as one particular category of life among many other, and how in that establishment of that same category, we allow some things to be made killable, eradicated, and to perpetuate a system of uneven reproduction of life itself. That becomes particularly relevant when we think about the categories of not only life and death, but also life as a non-life, the coupling of the two concepts of the bio and the geo maybe, and an invitation to think about the longer history of the settler colonial project as having rested on that distinction between life and between the lively and the inert, as Elizabeth Povinelli reminds us, and how that continues to be relevant if we're thinking about global climate change and environmental degradation. So maybe as our Dean Hashim Sarkis has proposed us to think for the Venice Biennale in 2021, how do we live together, since rescheduled and amplified by the question of how do we live together with multiple other scales, with the bio and the conditions of life and non-life. It might be an invitation also to think of an ethics of care that is necessary to enact the possibilities of a life as good as possible for as many as possible. Another colleague of ours, Mariana Arcaya, who would be a lovely interlocutor from DUSP on thinking of the question of health, reminds us that disasters have always been a part of life, but that the severity and number are expected to go up as the questions become, what are we going to do about that? And how do we expect individuals, again, the three scales, the individual body, the social body, and the political body to respond? Maybe landscape does hold also some possible answers, and I would love to hear from Sara on possible models and sets of techniques for understanding and intervening in such entangled world. Could permaculture be one way in which we could begin to think of earth care, people care, and fair shares? It's probably a field filled with critiques of some of these concepts, but I'm looking for moments in which narratives of the individual, the social, and the political bodies could begin to open up the project of critique to a project of imagining other possible worlds, of kind of frameworks to aspire to, worlds to imagine living in, maybe visions for a better world as we're all hammered in our individual selves of what are the highlights that we should be looking for. So on that note, maybe if we have the snippets from the story that tell us of the worlds worth living.
So I can just cover. I was, somebody that was enmeshed, and as I mentioned, in the healthcare world, right, and in the architecture world for some time, and then being in the middle of an ecological disaster, right, that did affect the landscape and did affect the bodies of the people that live there, really is what led me to a field that was considered different at the time, but I think, in the time that I went to get my MLA, I think the fields have become much more closer together. I think architecture is much more interested in issues of landscape, and we know at least the disciplines are intertwined, right? But now it's about communicating it to the larger world. I was really inspired when I was doing my research about some of these, when a lot of the literature started to turn towards vaccines and sort of the individual, the health of the individual, which is where I think we've maybe gone astray. And that's not just in architecture, that's in many worlds. And it's particular to the United States. And part of the reason I concentrate on the United States in my research is because I find it baffling. I found it baffling how in the US, first of all, we thought of health as only a treatment for disease, right, at the acute moment. And that disease is manifested in the individual choices of an individual, and that we somehow have free will, and that free will extends to where we live. When I started doing the research, I was instead inspired by writers that were outliers when vaccine and germ theory were starting to rise, and that is, the ecologist Aldo Leopold, who talked about ecosystems as similar to the body itself, and he talked about the eradication of species. What would happen if you eradicated a species, and that, like the pancreas, right? Like a pancreas would produce too much insulin, that it presented a disruption. And he was talking about how all these systems are knitted together. And I think that's what we have seen, and I hope we take from this pandemic, is that extends, to our ecosystem of everybody living in the city, and especially for our most vulnerable. And if we don't build the architecture, thinking about architecture that heals and not harms, as Michael has, so eloquently put it in his talks before, we all suffer. And so, I would encourage this sort of ecosystem thinking or ecological thinking. And what was interesting actually is when I started working more with public health researchers and actually teaching in a Department of Health and working with the Department of Health in Hawaii, right, on several projects, is that actually public health has always known this, and public health in of itself has sort of cleaved from medicine. But public health has always thought about these sort of ecological factors of health, and that is, changing behavior, but through a number of interventions and providing support. And now in public health, you subscribe to what's called the social determinants of health. And it talks about sort of, all of these environments and their proximity to the body and how that ultimately affects health outcomes. So what was interesting to me is, the built environment is somewhere in the middle of that circle, right? It's more immediate than, say, a policy environment. It's somewhat outside the environment of your immediate social circle or your family. And so I think, architecture and urban planning, though, can learn from that sort of ecological thinking and thinking about what it means. And of course, this is just from a landscape aspect. And I know, I would love to hear Michael's response on what it means for architecture, even though he's, very eloquently put it in talking about the spatial rights to breathe.
Thanks for that, Sarah. I'll try to say something that responds to that. But I mean, Ronnie, great question, and really, I think you brought up a really important element that I've been wrestling with, and I think we as a discipline have been wrestling with, which is this notion of scales. I think when we critique the architecture as a field, or the spatial disciplines, we might call them, as a field, I think we often oscillate between, are we critiquing the scale of the body politic, as you called it, or the social body? So for example, we can oscillate between planetary impacts of carbon offsets to redlining of neighborhoods. And architecture and design can be always critiqued for its impact on many of these different scales at all times. I think what has been more difficult for us to critique or understand architecture's role is at the scale of the body. So when you talk about it from the health perspective, and you work with public health folks or doctors, and you say architecture matters, trust me, it affects the health of a population, they really say, oh, really, does it? How so? Can you prove it to me? And the proof and the evidence is limited. I think we have to acknowledge that there has been very little, and it's very difficult to get substantial scholarly work around the direct effects of built environment or the spatial, let's call it the spatial determinants of health, but the architecture on my physical health and my physical body. And I think what that's maybe potentially kept us from doing is building a body of evidence and a body of empowered knowledge to argue for the value of architecture that does shape behavior and also shapes health. And now with COVID, I think this is the point I was trying to make, that we have opened up a clear kind of a direct line to see where we all understand now that there is a direct health relationship on our body from the built environment. And that is new. I think this is a new moment, a new paradigmatic shift. It is no longer that just like public health is about the collective, right? Harvey and Lefebvre are talking about collective rights, and we're talking about individual rights here. That's a different thing, and it's a new thing, actually. And I think it offers us real opportunity to demand changes in policy, changes in practice, changes in spatial arrangement, but it also empowers us as a discipline to say, not just we matter and you need to hire us, but like without architectural thinking, we may be injuring people directly. The other thinker I often use to help understand this, and you mentioned the biosphere and biopolitics, is Johann Galtung, who talks about the theories of peace studies, and he calls it the peace triangle. There's three types of peace, he says. And therefore there's three types of violence. There's direct violence, the violence on the body. There's a structural violence, the systems which keep people from achieving their full potential. We're talking a lot about structural violence today, structural racism, structural injury. And then there's cultural violence. And obviously they're intertwined, but not every act of cultural violence is an act of direct violence. And not every act of direct violence is an act of cultural violence or structural violence, but they affect each other. And his reason for separating these three is to say, if we're going to enact anti-violence or peace, we have to know which scale we're intervening at in order to address these issues. So I go back to architecture in this space. I say, look, architecture, every building affects the planet, every building affects our community, every building also affects our body. Where are you interrupting and intervening in your design proposal so that we understand the scale of intervention? And some buildings are going to have much bigger planetary impacts. Some are going to have much more direct health impacts. And they're not all the same, but they, the knowledge of how they intervene in all three intersectionally helps us critique them more effectively. And also appreciate them more effectively, I would say. Because I think the last point is, the Olmsted quote at the end from Sara is a really good one. Here's a brilliant designer. He's changed the discipline. He, an abolitionist, a moral hero, and so many other positive things that Olmsted did throughout his career and in that project, and also affected a significant form of cultural violence by the erasure of communities beforehand. So these things are held in tension. It doesn't mean Central Park is a disaster, but it means we have to understand it within this framework and better critique and appreciate it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that's you're echoing one of the questions from the audience. I think the conversation in terms of how public health has expanded the kind of the environmental movement beyond what was perceived as a smaller white bubble into engaging more explicitly questions of environmental justice and situating environmental unevenness along racial and ethnic lines, as well as maybe the legacy of Olmsted as someone who has himself traveled through the Cotton Kingdom and kind of experienced the unevenness of landscape design. I think some of the questions from the audience are asking, how do we understand in this moment, particularly given the current climate in the United States, the questions of the right to wear amidst the violence perpetuated and the lack of capacity to breathe. So I think some of the questions on the social contract as it impacts an environmental contract. And I'll add another one because I think they might be related. So the question explicitly read, how do you see the right to air contested with the current social climate of the United States? And a related question is, what is the role of the social body in architectural pedagogy, especially in relation to engaging with other disciplines in the design process? So I think one question is on the current social climate and social body, and the other maybe is an invitation to think about the question of disciplines and the convergence between, planning, design, and policy, and architecture in this case, and maybe the value of thinking of the broader term of the environment. I can't help but think that maybe the biases of being trained in a school that still celebrates environmental design as the kind of carrier umbrella might be one way in which the difficulty of convincing of architectural contributions to the quality of health might be bypassed if the broader framework is one of environmental design. So maybe Michael on the right to wear.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I think it means, at least for me, and maybe it's this case for other practitioners out there, when we talk to other potential community groups or folks that we might work with, often the first question is, well, why do we need an architect? Why do we need an architect if we're figuring out ourselves? Like, what is the role of the designer in helping, in offering service, in providing a new way of thinking? It's too complicated. Architecture is something that's a service for the elite, or it's something that we can't afford. That we have lost agency in our articulation of our value proposition to the public good and to the social body. And when we talk to doctors, it is this case, well, prove to me that architecture has an effect on health. But I think what we learned from COVID, it's even deeper, that if buildings affect our right to breathe, our ability to breathe, they affect our right to live. And if architecture is affecting our ability to access fundamental rights, then it is actually participating in a much more deeper and structural way than I think we even study it, or even attempt to articulate its value in the public domain. And that to me is like a really grounding moment, I think. It really sobers me to think that the choices that we make affect people's rights. Where I think for some time we've been, critical, but also like, what can I do? I have no idea. We can't prove it affects people's rights. I mean, it's not really my fault. I made these decisions as a designer. And that kind of, I think this transition from this sort of ho-hum, or even call it autonomous project, which is very deliberate, like we are not involved in that. We want to extract ourselves from a discussion of power and relationships of rights into a place where we can't help but participate and affect the rights of others. It not only sobers us, but I think it can empower us to engage in other disciplines that have managed to ask those very questions, like public health, like sociology, like other disciplines, to help us sort of address those issues so that we can still act. And I think the worst thing that would come out of this moment is another disciplinary paralysis. If we were paralyzed in action, then we really lose. I think we really lose the ability at this moment to say, we affect fundamental rights to life, and it's our responsibility as a discipline to fight for those. We have no other choice. As opposed to what I think we've been determined, and our practice has been called a social architectural practice. I reject those terms because that suggests that you can choose to be working on social projects and not. And this has been a debate within the history of architecture. I referenced it when you're turning the modern project into a style. I mean, the same oscillation between style and the social project has been a luxury we can no longer afford to perpetuate again. This is a problem, I think, in our theory. And we're at this moment where it's all coming together and it's clear. I think there's a clear pathway where the decisions you made affect health, they affect rights, they affect access to those rights, but they also can liberate and empower and offer alternative ways of supporting and empowering people. And that's a really powerful moment, I think.
Yeah, I just wanted to extend on what Michael said, is that I hope, I didn't give this impression in my talk, but I also think this is a moment of hope. And I also wanted to echo a point Michael's made a couple of times, is that, yes, it's the body of work that, when people ask you to prove how architecture and landscape architecture affects health outcomes, it's narrow because it's also very different modes of inquiry, right? I started my research looking at walkability studies because I was trying to determine, okay, like what it makes a safe place to walk, or what gets people to walk. And if you read the literature, which primarily comes from public health, they're trying to narrow it down to say, is it benches? Is it the width of the sidewalk? Is it whatever? And actually, one of my first projects in Hawaii, when I was working with Department of Transportation and Department of Health, they had done a street study 5 years earlier. It was led by a great public health researcher, but they were trying to determine the walkability of streets in Hawaii, and they ran it like a public health study where they randomly selected 200 streets across the entire state on 4 different islands, and we're looking at those factors to determine what the walkability of streets were. And then when I became the PI on the project, I said, well, can we take a network approach to it? Like to understand like whether it's effective or not, we have to see whether these streets join together. Architecture in the built environment, we can't isolate elements as they want to do in scientific inquiry. So I think on both ends, it sort of takes an understanding of how people answer a question. So I think that's one thing that's holding it back. But keep in mind that architects, landscape architects, urban planners, public health officials, they came together before in the midst of an acute crisis, which were the filth diseases of the Industrial Revolution. And so maybe this is the moment where we can come together again while keeping in mind the mistakes of the past. And I think something that contributes to the paralysis Michael talked about is, for better or worse, we are, as designers and planners of the built environment, aware of these harms that we have inflicted on people. And so maybe maybe it's not just saying we can't do anything, but I think there is some hesitancy of doing too much sometimes. But I think if we go into it with eyes wide open of all these issues, this can be a really positive moment of inflection.
Maybe I can jump in with a few comments with a perspective from the history of technology. And I very much appreciated the broad sweep of history. And it resonates with me as an engineer and historian of technology. And yet, you know, the pandemic certainly is a reminder of the hubris of the idea of infinite progress. And there's a brilliant researcher, Eric Schatzberg, who writes about progress ideology. And, you know, if we think about our own campus, I was reflecting today in our studio that the main group from 105 years ago has very tall double hung windows. The sashes open like this. So you got an opening at the top and an opening at the bottom, and you got circulation of fresh air in our classrooms, as well as daylighting, of course. Well, where are we now? Those windows are mostly painted shut and not operable. And yet here we are as this advanced institution of technology who can solve everything. And, you know, certainly this is a humbling reminder. And as we think about the planetary considerations that Rania referenced, I mean, the irony of it all is the planet is taking a deep breath, right? The planet is saying, oh, finally, a little bit of fresh air. And I'm also hopeful that we're going to kind of recenter ourselves as professions working in the built environment as a result. But I think there's a lovely question that really captures the way we think about harnessing technology. And so I want to bring in this audience question, which is primarily for Sara, but I know Michael's working in the area as well. And it's, Sara, you mentioned a distinction between medicine and public health. What could architecture learn from public health as opposed to medicine? Because it certainly feels like in my own discipline of building technology, we've got a bunch of surgeons and doctors who are running around prescribing advanced technologies and not taking the public health approach. So how would you answer that question about what architecture can learn from public health?
Yeah, it's funny. I think truthfully, as I've been writing the book, I've always conceptualized as architecture is medicine, as landscape architecture is the public health, and maybe that's sort of predicated my move into another into the other field. But to look at architecture specifically, I think it's you know, thinking about flexibility in the space, and I would say, you know, as Michael put it, you need the literal technology to breathe and the literal right to breathe. But I would also say the sort of metaphorical right to breathe and allowing a freedom of choice, and there has to be a slight level of indeterminacy, right, in how you think about behavior in the buildings. And you know, you and Michael and I had this discussion in studio, talking about the degrees of control, right, and how we've thought about architecture over time. And we're talking about schools, we're talking about behavior, we're talking about young children. And so I think what architecture can learn from public health is that to change behavior over a period of time takes incremental change, right, not immediate change. And I try and touch on that when I talk about public housing and sort of like immediately changing the environments of public housing. That's not what's needed. What I've learned from my colleagues in public health is that to change behavior takes a long time period. It takes building up a culture of health. It's something I learned working with a nonprofit group that was focused on healthy design, is that you always have to make the healthy choice the easy choice, is that's part of it too, right? It's not about environmental determinism, but it's about presenting the best choices that lead to the best outcomes. And so I think those are the more difficult aspects to get at from public health. And I would say those have to be provided on top of providing, you know, the very direct health benefits that we've talked about. And, you know, I truly believe rebuilding in health as an ethic, right? It is in our ethic as architects, but I think as of late, it's become an amenity. And I worry about health becoming an amenity again, especially when I read articles about, putting UV lights in office buildings, right? Or who gets those decontamination rooms, or who even gets the space for their home offices, and who gets to stay at home and work and not have to travel.
But our tendency toward technological fixes and quick fixes, the HEPA filters, the UV lights, are part of a larger belief that we are somehow at the pinnacle of all time in terms of progress. So, Michael, what would you say to that audience question?
Sorry, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think I put a pin on those same points that Sara is mentioning. She mentioned some really important lessons from public health, incremental change and culture change. There's a saying in activism, kind of like in social movement work, which is that culture change leads to social change. It's not the other way around. We create a cultural shift, which then leads to social change, which then leads to policy change. And sometimes that culture change has to be like seriously designed. I think I use this example a lot because it really changed the way I think about, in this case, the space of public monuments. But because we're going through this conversation around the space of the public monument for good reason, and there's a lot of different theories about how we change them. Well, I look back at the AIDS quilt as a really good example. It's called the Names Project. You may remember is a brilliant, absolutely transformative project, and not a permanent memorial, but probably one of the most profound memorials ever to be built. And it just began with an idea that, first of all, AIDS was not being recognized. There was policies were not being implemented to protect and save people dying of this epidemic, of course, an epidemic. And activists came together and said, we want to change the culture so we not only recognize the fundamental rights that are being taken away but also to literally save lives. And so they created a design project. We're going to design a panel. Every person who wants to contribute would design their own panel, and then we're going to lay 90,000 panels on the National Mall and create a visual display of the loss of life and the human dignity that's associated with that loss. And not just a number, not just one other person that we don't want to recognize and don't acknowledge, one other name ticked off, but actually the human dignity that is being lost and taken away. And once you see it, you can't unsee that. It's just a profound image to see that and to experience it and to be brought into that deep human empathy that connects us to others. And so many in the activist community, credit the AIDS quilt for really changing the culture, which then led to significant social and policy change. So, I mean, in that same sense, public health has learned the hard way also that it doesn't matter how many numbers you get or how much data you get. If you don't change the culture of the provision of healthcare, we're not really going to change things. I think we in the design community, especially design community that is increasingly becoming politicized and activated, and good for that, also have to keep in mind that process, that we can design the process of culture change through our work. But it is incremental, I think, key word. It is processual. And this is also, I think, one of the real assets that we have that other disciplines don't have. It has a long time horizon. Architecture, unlike some other disciplines, we also have to talk about what does architecture and design, what its superpowers are. One of its superpowers is that it has a long time horizon. I was saying this in class today, but I know we're all getting stressed out, as we should be, about November 3rd. On November 4th, you might make a decision in your design office, draw a line, a designer room, and that room probably won't be built until like 4 years from now. After this cycle, this political cycle is probably over. We're working in that time horizon. We're thinking not just about what happens tomorrow and how we get through January, but like how we get through 2023, because the decisions we make now are really going to be, emerging in 2022, 2023. It's important for us to keep that in mind. We have a slower change and a slower culture, and that it can be a real ally. It also can be a burden to us impatient for change. But I think we can lean on it in certain times to acknowledge what we can affect and what we can't. And that's an important distinction where we might differentiate ourselves from public health.
That's really powerful. Thank you, Michael. So we are just about out of time, and I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of the questions, but Rania or Sara, would either of you like to leave us, or both of you, with some closing thoughts on this wide-ranging and inspiring set of issues?
I can't help but think of the spatial implications of infinite progress as we're thinking of the infinite interior as one of the spaces that we're invited to think of most explicitly now in terms of questions of health, and maybe where Nicholas started us off as the architecture of antibiotic amnesia, maybe the coupling with that with an understanding of the thermal condition of the interior as kind of a carbon amnesia that now hits the reminder of climate change might couple again some of these environmental questions of individual health and the health of the planet. So hopefully also the day after the next US election, since we're doing a public announcement on invitations to vote, is also when the US withdraws from the Paris Accord, November 4th. So there's a lot at stake in terms of individual and planetary health in that respect.
I think when all these current issues get overwhelming, which they frequently have to me, and I'm sure to many people listening tonight, I actually take heart in that. The one consistency I found in my research is if you start with an equitable piece of green space for everybody, with fresh air and with sunlight in every housing unit, and give every person a safe housing unit as well, we can start with that, right? That has been consistent throughout history. So how we do that equitably, safe houses, safe green spaces, we can build up from there. But that's a unit we can always start with.
Well, I just want to say thank you very much, Sara and Michael and Rania. It was an absolute privilege to share this with you, and it's a privilege to be leading a studio together with Michael and Sara this semester, looking at Cambridge Public Schools and thinking about how we can directly impact improving design and educational spaces here. I also can't help but think that the four of us are all parents, so we wake up every morning and go to bed every night with a real reason to try to find some kind of hope in the future, as well as planning how we're going to spend our day on Zoom with wild animals lurching around in the background. But an absolute privilege. And thank you all so much for joining us. And I'd like to invite you as well to our next event next Thursday, the 22nd at 6, a lecture hosted with our History, Theory, and Criticism Forum, titled Black Material Culture in the Round by scholar of race and architecture, Charles Davis II. And then the following week on the 22nd, we'll co-host a special event with the Harvard Graduate School of Design titled The Architecture of Democracy, a conversation hosted by Mark Lee and Nicholas de Monchaux with colleagues from Harvard and MIT. And you can see the full list at architecture.mit.edu. So a huge virtual round of applause to our speakers this evening, and thank you all so much for joining us.